My name is Victor, and at 50, I thought I'd finally earned the right to silence. I spent 30 years in the roar of a machine shop, my ears ringing with the scream of turning metal. So, when I bought the small dacha in the village of Vereskova, I wasn't looking for neighbors or friends. I was looking for a piece of land where I could grow my cabbage, raise a few chickens, and die slowly in the sun. The house was old, built of heavy logs that had turned black with time. The soil was strange, dark, almost purple, and it felt cold even in the mid-August heat. Nothing grows here for long. Viktor, the old neighbor, Stepan, warned me over the fence on my first week. This land, it's hungry. It takes more than it gives. I laughed at him. I had a tractor, a shovel, and stubbornness. I planted rows of cabbage, built a sturdy coop for my 20 hens, and bought a young calf I named Borka. The trouble started in the third week. First, it was the cabbage. I woke up to find an entire row shredded. Not eaten, shredded. The leaves were scattered like confetti, soaked in a foul-smelling, yellowish slime. I cursed, thinking it was a stray dog or a massive badger. I set a couple of heavy iron traps, the kind that can snap a wolf's leg. The next morning, the traps were gone. Not tripped, gone. The heavy chains had been snapped like they were made of dry straw. And Borka, the calf, was trembling in the barn, his flank covered in long, shallow scratches that looked like they were made by a hand with too many fingers. Thieves, I growled, cleaning my old double-barreled shotgun. City punks looking for an easy score. I went to the village store to complain, but the mood was grim. Stepan was there, looking like he hadn't slept in a month. "It's not thieves, Viktor," he whispered, his hands shaking as he clutched a loaf of bread. "My goats are gone. All of them. Not a bone left. It's the earth eaters. They've come up from the old mines again." I ignored him. Old man's tales. That night, I sat on my porch with the shotgun across my knees. The moon was a sickly yellow sliver. The silence was absolute. No crickets, no owls. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Around 2 a.m., a scream tore through the dark. It was a chicken, but the sound was cut short by a wet, crunching noise. I lunged off the porch, my flashlight cutting a frantic beam through the mist. I sprinted to the coop, the heavy boots thumping against the purple earth. I kicked the door open, my finger on the trigger. In the center of the coop, crouched over the bloody remains of my best layer, was a figure. It was about 1.5 meters tall, hunched on 4 spindly, gray limbs. It didn't have fur. Its skin looked like wet clay, translucent enough to see black veins pulsing underneath. It didn't have eyes, only a massive, vertical slit for a mouth, filled with rows of needle-like teeth that were currently dripping with red feathers and gore. It froze, the flashlight beam illuminating its slick, muscular back. It made a sound like a wet rag being torn in half. "Hey!" I roared, the fear turning into a cold, white-hot rage. The creature turned. It didn't have a face, just that yawning, bloody vertical maw. It hissed, a sound that vibrated in my skull, and lunged. Boom! I fired the first barrel. The buckshot caught it in the shoulder, spraying dark, thick fluid that smelled like old copper and stagnant water. The creature shrieked, a high-pitched metallic sound, and scrambled over the fence with impossible speed, disappearing into the dark woods behind my garden. I stood there, my heart hammering against my ribs, the smell of gunpowder mixing with the stench of the creature. The next morning, I told the village. I showed them the blood on the fence, but they just looked at the ground. "You shouldn't have shot it, Viktor," Stepan said, his voice hollow. "Now it knows your scent. Now it knows you're not just food, but an enemy." I spent the day boarding up the windows and reinforcing the doors. I felt like a fool, but the memory of that faceless thing made my skin crawl. Night fell again. I sat in the kitchen, the shotgun loaded with slugs this time. I was waiting for the coop. I was waiting for the fence, but the sound didn't come from outside. Scritch, scritch, scritch. A long, rhythmic scratching sound came from the window right behind my head. I turned slowly, the sweat dripping into my eyes. Pressed against the glass was a long, gray hand with 6 joints in each finger. And then a mouth opened against the pane, a vertical slit of darkness, and a voice, a perfect, distorted imitation of my own, whispered through the glass. "Victor, the soil is so cold. Listen to the warmth." I didn't think, I reacted. I spun around and slammed the butt of my shotgun against the window frame, hoping to shatter the glass and the creature's face along with it. But the pane didn't break. It felt as hard as diamond, and my blow only sent a jarring vibration up my arms. The gray hand stayed pressed against the glass. The vertical mouth opened wider, revealing rows of black teeth that seemed to vibrate. "Warmth, Victor. So much warmth inside," the thing whispered again. It wasn't just my voice anymore. It was a chorus of voices, Stepan's, the shopkeeper's, and a woman's voice I hadn't heard in 20 years. My late wife. "Get away from my house," I screamed, backing toward the kitchen table. The creature didn't move. It just stared with its lack of eyes, its skin pulsing with that sickly purple light. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it slid down the wall and vanished into the shadows of the porch. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the middle of the kitchen floor, the shotgun aimed at the window. Every creak of the old house felt like a footstep. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. I realized then that the village wasn't just quiet, it was terrified. The silence wasn't peace, it was a prayer. When the sun finally began to bleed through the gray clouds, I went outside. My garden was a graveyard. The remaining cabbages were pulled out by the roots and arranged in a perfect, terrifying circle around the house. In the center of the circle sat the head of my calf, Borka. There was no blood on the ground. The earth had swallowed it all. I marched over to Stepan's house, my shotgun in hand. I didn't knock. I kicked the door open. Stepan was sitting at his table, staring at a bowl of gray porridge. He didn't even look up. "It's starting, isn't it?" he asked. "What is that thing, Stepan?" I shot it, and it came back. It talked to me. It used my own voice. Stepan finally looked at me, and I saw the milky film of cataracts over his eyes. They aren't just animals, Victor. They're the land itself. Long ago, before the mines, people here made deals. A life for a harvest, a soul for a season. But the village forgot the old ways. We stopped feeding the soil. So now, the soil takes what it wants. "I don't care about old ways," I spat. "I'm calling the police. I'm getting out of here. The phones don't work past the bridge, Victor. And the road. Have you looked at the road this morning?" I ran to the edge of my property. The dirt road that led to the city was gone. In its place was a deep, jagged trench, as if a giant plow had torn through the earth overnight. The soil in the trench was moving, writhing with thousands of pale, thick worms that looked like human fingers. I was trapped. I spent the afternoon turning my house into a fortress. I nailed boards over every window. I moved the heavy oak dresser in front of the front door. I found a can of gasoline in the shed and made a dozen Molotov cocktails. If I was going down, I was going to turn this hungry land into a bonfire. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature plummeted. A thick, unnatural mist began to roll in from the forest. It wasn't white. It was a bruised, dark violet. I sat in the living room, a single candle burning on the table. Around 9 p.m., the scratching started again. But this time, it wasn't just one window. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It was coming from the walls, from the floorboards, from the ceiling. "Viktor!" A voice called out from under the floor. It sounded like my mother. "It's so dark down here. Why did you leave me in the ground?" "Shut up," I yelled, firing a shot into the floor. The blast was deafening in the small room. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a heavy thud shook the front door. Something huge had slammed against it. The oak dresser slid a few inches. Thud! The wood of the door began to groan. A pale, gray finger pushed through a gap in the boards, then another. They weren't trying to break the door. They were melting through it. The wood was turning into soft, gray mush wherever the creature touched it. I grabbed a Molotov cocktail and lit the rag. "Come on then, you bastards." The door finally gave way, and 3 of the creatures crawled in. They moved with a horrific, spider-like grace, their gray limbs clicking against the floor. But they weren't alone. Behind them stood something much taller, a figure nearly 3 meters high, draped in rags that looked like rotted burial shrouds. It had a face, but it was a stolen one. It was wearing Stepan's face. The tall figure opened its mouth, Stepan's mouth, and a sound like 1,000 grinding stones filled the room. "The harvest is late, Viktor, and the earth is very, very hungry." I threw the gasoline bottle. The glass bottle shattered against the chest of the creature wearing Stepan's face. A roar of orange flame erupted, illuminating the room with a violent, flickering light. The smell of gasoline fought against the stench of wet earth and rot. The tall figure didn't scream. It didn't even flinch. It stood there as the fire licked at its gray, leathery skin, the flames turning a strange, sickly green as they consumed whatever foul fluids ran through its veins. The 3 smaller creatures hissed and scurried back into the shadows of the hallway, their many-jointed limbs clicking like dry sticks. "Fire is just a fever, Viktor," the thing with Stepan's face said, its voice vibrating through the floorboards rather than the air. "And the earth always cools the fever." As I watched in horror, the black-purple soil began to ooze up through the cracks in the floorboards. It wasn't mud. It was like a living tide of sludge. It crawled up the legs of the burning monster, dousing the flames with a wet, hissing sound. Within seconds, the fire was out, leaving only charred rags and the smell of burnt hair. I scrambled back, grabbing my shotgun. I didn't aim for the head. I aimed for the legs. Boom! The slug tore through the creature's knee. It buckled, falling one side, but instead of blood, a thick, root-like mass of fibers spilled out of the wound. It began to knit itself back together instantly, drawing strength from the soil oozing through the floor. "You want the harvest?" I roared, my voice breaking. "Then have it." I didn't fire again. I turned and ran toward the kitchen, toward the back door. I knew I couldn't hold the house. The very foundation was betrayed me. I kicked the back door open and sprinted into the night, carrying only my shotgun, a handful of shells, and the remaining Molotovs in a satchel. The mist outside was so thick I could barely see my own boots. The purple earth felt soft, like walking on a giant, bruised fruit. Every step I took felt like the ground was trying to suck my boots down, holding me in place for the things following in the dark. I headed for the barn. It was built on a concrete slab, the only piece of ground that wasn't alive. As I ran, I heard them. Not just one or two, but dozens. They were in the trees, under the porch, crawling through the shredded rows of my garden. They were whispering my name in 1,000 different voices. "Viktor, stay and feed us." I reached the barn and slammed the heavy iron bolt shut. I climbed up the ladder to the hayloft, my lungs burning, my 50-year-old heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. From the small hayloft window, I looked back at the house. It was sinking. The old log cabin was slowly being pulled into the earth. The purple soil was rising like a tide, swallowing the porch, then the windows. I could hear the wood groaning and snapping, the sound of a house being chewed and swallowed. Then I saw Stepan's house across the fence. It was already gone. Only a flat, dark circle of earth remained where his home had stood for 60 years. Suddenly, the roof of the barn groaned. Something heavy had landed on it. Thump! Thump! I looked up. The corrugated metal was beginning to dent inward. Something was walking up there, something heavy enough to bend steel. Then a long gray finger, 6 inches long, poked through a hole in the roof. It wasn't trying to get in. It was drawing something on the metal. I shone my light up. The finger was scratching a symbol into the roof, the same geometric eye I had seen in my nightmares. And then the scratching stopped. A single eye opened in the roof. Not a human eye. A massive, yellow orb with a horizontal pupil, looking down at me through the torn metal. "Victor," the eye whispered, though it had no mouth. "The earth has no life because we have taken it all. And now, we take the last of you." The concrete floor of the barn, the only thing I thought was safe, began to crack. A massive, pale root, thick as a man's torso and covered in sharp, obsidian thorns, burst through the center of the floor, reaching for the hayloft. I stood at the edge of the loft, the shotgun trembling in my hands. I had 2 shells left, and the barn was turning into a throat. The massive root, slick with a translucent, foul-smelling sap, whipped through the air like a blind snake. It struck the wooden support beam of the hayloft, and the heavy timber snapped with a sound like a rifle shot. The loft tilted precariously, sending a cascade of dry hay down into the darkness below. I fired the shotgun into the writhing mass of the root. Boom! The slug tore a chunk out of the fibrous flesh, and a spray of gray, cold liquid hit my face. It tasted like bitter metal. The root recoiled for a second, but then 3 more burst through the concrete floor, smaller and faster, like the fingers of a buried titan. I didn't wait to be cornered. I grabbed the edge of the hayloft and leaped down, landing hard on the cracked concrete. My 50-year-old knees buckled, and a sharp pain shot up my spine, but adrenaline is a hell of a drug. I rolled to my feet and sprinted for the barn doors. I threw the bolt and burst out into the night. The world had changed again. The purple mist was so thick now that the trees looked like twisted, skeletal limbs reaching out of a boiling sea. But it wasn't the mist that stopped me. It was the sound. The entire village was screaming. Not just people, the animals, the wood of the houses, the very air. I looked toward the village center. The earth there had collapsed into a massive, jagged sinkhole, at least 50 meters wide. A pale, pulsating light was emanating from the depths, casting long, rhythmic shadows against the mist. "Victor, don't look away," the voice whispered. It was coming from right beside me. I spun around. It was the creature I had shot on the first night, the 1.5-meter crawler. Its shoulder was a mess of scarred, gray tissue where my buckshot had hit, but it didn't seem to care. It was standing on its hind legs now, its vertical mouth twitching. "You saw the eye, Victor. Now see the heart." The creature didn't attack. It turned and began to hop toward the sinkhole, its movements hypnotic and fluid. Against my better judgment, I followed. My house was gone, my livestock was gone, and the road was destroyed. There was nowhere else to go but toward the center of the nightmare. As I reached the edge of the sinkhole, my breath caught in my throat. Down in the depths, buried under centuries of Vereskova's soil, was a structure. It wasn't a mine. It was a rib cage. Massive, fossilized bones, each the size of a skyscraper, arched over a glowing, fleshy core that looked like a heart the size of a cathedral. The core was pulsing. Thump, 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 and connected to the heart were thousands of those pale roots. They stretched out in every direction like veins, reaching under the houses, under the gardens, under the forest. I realized then that the Earth Eaters weren't a separate species. They were white blood cells. They were the scavengers bringing nutrients back to this ancient, buried god. "On this land, there is no life," I whispered, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. Because the land is the life. It's one single, starving organism. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet gave way. I slid down the jagged slope of the sinkhole, tumbling into the darkness. I landed on a soft, spongy surface, a carpet of crushed bones and fermented vegetation. I looked up, and through the haze of dust and purple mist, I saw them. Hundreds of the creatures, the crawlers, the mimics, the tall things, were standing on the ribs of the ancient beast, looking down at me. They weren't hissing anymore. They were silent, expectant. The tall figure with Stepan's face stepped forward from the shadows of a giant bone. Its skin was no longer gray. It was turning the same pulsing purple as the heart below. "The cycle is nearly complete, Victor. The village of Vereskova has been fed to the deep. You're the last survivor. the last witness. And every god needs a priest to tell its story before he is consumed. I gripped my shotgun, but I knew it was useless. I looked at the pulsing heart, and I saw something trapped inside the translucent outer membrane. It was Stepan. He was alive, his eyes wide and vacant, his body being slowly absorbed into the glowing flesh. And next to him, there was an empty space. A space just the right size for a 50-year-old man who just wanted some peace. "I'm not a priest," I growled, reaching into my satchel for the last Molotov. "I'm a gardener, and it's time to weed this place." I lit the rag, but as I raised my arm to throw, the ground beneath the heart opened, and a voice, not a voice of man, but a vibration of the planet itself, spoke directly into my mind. "Feed me, Viktor, and I will show you the world as it was before the first seed fell." The vibration of the voice didn't just echo in my ears. It vibrated in my teeth, my joints, and the very marrow of my bones. The Molotov cocktail in my hand felt heavy, the flame dancing on the rag, but my arm wouldn't move. It was as if the air around me had turned into thick, cold honey. "Feed me." The pulsing heart of the world flared with a blinding, ultraviolet light. Suddenly, the cavern disappeared. The smell of gasoline and rot was gone, replaced by the scent of ozone and ancient, salty rain. I wasn't standing in a sinkhole anymore. I was standing on a vast, volcanic plain under a sky that was the color of a fresh bruise. Giant ferns, hundreds of feet tall, swayed in a wind that tasted like sulfur. And there, moving across the horizon, were the things that the Earth Eaters were modeled after, colossal, silent titans of flesh and stone, breathing in unison with the planet. I saw the birth of the forest. I saw the first humans, small and shivering, kneeling before the purple earth, offering their children to the roots so the soil would let the wheat grow. I saw the mines being dug, the iron teeth of industry biting into the sleeping god below Vereskova. I saw the pain of the earth. Every time a shovel bit into the ground, it was a wound. Every time we built a road, it was a scar. We were here before the sun was bright. Viktor, the voice of the heart spoke, now manifesting as a projection of my own younger self, standing just out of reach. "You call us monsters because we take. Но что такое человек, если не паразит, который только потребляет? You grow your cabbage to kill it and eat it. We grow you for the same reason." The vision shattered. I was back in the pit, the heat from the Molotov finally stinging my hand. The tall figure with Stepan's face was closer now. It reached out a long, jointed hand and gently took the bottle from my frozen fingers. It didn't break it. It simply squeezed the glass until it turned back into sand, the gasoline evaporating into a harmless mist. "Viktor," it whispered, its stolen eyes leaking gray fluid. "The 50 years of your life, the work at the factory, the ringing in your ears, the death of your wife, it was all just a seasoning, a ripening. You are at your peak. Your bitterness makes you sweet to the earth." I felt the roots beginning to wrap around my ankles. They weren't crushing me. They were soft, almost like a mother's touch, but they were beginning to fuse with my skin. I could feel my nervous system connecting to a network that spanned the entire continent. I saw the village from above, or rather from below. I felt Stepan's heart slowing down inside the core. I felt the hunger of the 3-meter giants. And for a second, the fear vanished. In its place came a horrific, cold peace. Why fight the ground you will eventually return to? Why struggle against the cycle that began before the first star? "No," I gasped, the word tasting like dust. I am Viktor. I am a man. A man is just a walking piece of soil that hasn't realized it's dead yet. The younger Viktor projection said, stepping into the pulsing light of the heart. The roots reach my waist. My shotgun, my last link to the world of metal and fire, fell into the sludge and was instantly swallowed. I looked up at the circle of sky far above. The stars were beginning to fade. Morning was coming to a world that no longer included me. But then I felt something in my pocket. Something small, hard and cold. The lighter. I hadn't dropped it. And the ground here, it wasn't just roots and bone. The air in this cavern was thick with methane and the gases of 1 billion years of decomposition. The Earth Eaters wanted a priest? They wanted a witness? If I'm a seasoning, I grunted, my hands trembling as I fumbled for the lighter. Then let's make this meal spicy. The roots had reached my chest. I could feel the thin, needle-like fibers beginning to lace into my ribs, searching for my lungs, seeking to synchronize my breath with the slow, tectonic rhythm of the buried heart. The cold peace was an intoxicating drug, whispering that my struggle was over, that I could finally rest and become part of something eternal. Yes, Viktor, the voices of the village, now a singular, massive choir, hummed in my skull. Let go. The ringing in your ears will stop. The silence you wanted is here. But I didn't want the silence of the grave. I wanted the silence of a man who has finished a hard day's work and earned his sleep, not a man who has been harvested like a head of cabbage. My right arm was nearly pinned, but my hand was still inside my pocket, my fingers white-knuckled around the small Zippo lighter. It was a gift from my wife 20 years ago. To light your way home, she had said. I didn't try to pull my arm out. I knew the creatures were watching my every move. The tall thing with Stepan's face leaned in, its vertical maw twitching in anticipation of the final fusion. You're right, I whispered, my voice a dry rattle. This land is hungry. I flicked the lighter inside my pocket. Click. The spark was tiny, but in a chamber filled with the concentrated methane of eons and the volatile gases of a god's digestion, it was enough. The explosion didn't start with a bang. It started with a blue flash that ignited the very air I was breathing. The pocket of my jacket blew outward, and a wall of pressure slammed into the heart of the world. The scream that followed wasn't human. It was the sound of a tectonic plate snapping, a mountain grinding into dust. The purple light of the cavern was instantly drowned out by a roaring, incandescent orange. The roots holding me shriveled and blackened in an instant. The sudden release sent me tumbling backward into the sludge as the ceiling of the cavern, the very foundation of Vereskova, began to rain down in massive, flaming chunks. I saw the tall figure vanish in a pillar of fire. I saw the heart of the world shudder, its translucent membrane bursting like a scorched blister. Stepan, or what was left of him, was consumed in a fraction of a second. I scrambled through the burning muck, my clothes on fire, my skin blistered, driven by a primal, lizard-brain instinct to survive. I didn't look for a path. I climbed the shifting, collapsing ribs of the ancient titan. Every breath was a lungful of fire and ash. I reached the lip of the sinkhole just as the entire center of the village collapsed into a vacuum of flame. The earth let out a final, shuddering moan, and then silence. I dragged myself away from the edge, crawling through the charred remains of my garden. The purple mist was gone, burned away by the heat. The morning sun was finally breaking over the horizon, a pale, honest gray. I turned on my back and looked at the sky. My dacha was gone. The barn was gone. Vereskova was no longer a village. It was a blackened scar on the face of the earth. I survived, but as I lay there, I felt a familiar sensation. Scritch, scritch. I looked at my hand. The skin wasn't just burned. Beneath the blisters, it was gray. Hard. I tried to close my fist, and I heard the sound of grinding stone. I reached into my ear, which had been ringing for 30 years. The ringing was gone. In its place, I heard a low, rhythmic thumping deep beneath the ground. Thump, 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 thump. The heart was damaged, but it wasn't dead. It was just waiting, and a piece of it was still inside me, a dormant seed waiting for the next season. I stood up, my joints creaking like old wood. I looked at the road. It wasn't a trench anymore, it was just dirt. I started to walk. I didn't look back at the scorched earth of my dream retirement. I am Viktor. I am 50 years old, and I know now that on this earth, there's no life that doesn't eventually become the soil. The only question is, Who will be the next watchman to stand over the grave?